The origin of the Roman people is one as mysterious and uncertain as any event in classical history. And whilst it's difficult to separate the hard facts and the apocryphal speculations and stories created by writers at the height of the Republic and Empire, we do know the story that the Romans told themselves about the foundation of their city. It has everything a legendary story can do: mythical twins, virgin birth, a cursed rivalry, descendant from a Greek hero and a god, a magical rescue from an animal as well. So whilst it's unlikely to be completely based in truth, the founding myth of the city, which would go on to dominate the Mediterranean, is important to understand for anyone interested in its later history, as it puts into perspective the way that the Romans saw themselves and their place in the world. After Troy was sacked by the Greeks, Aeneas, who was a lieutenant of Hector, formed up a group of refugees and sailed for the Mediterranean to find a new home. They left Asia and went to Africa. Here he met and fell in love with Dido, the Phoenician queen of the new city that would go on to become Carthage, before abandoning her and breaking her heart. Before her suicide, Dido cursed both of their descendants to eternal hatred of each other, a story which the Romans created to frame their rivalry with Carthage as having been a matter of destiny. The Trojans sailed for the west coast of Italy and came into conflict with the locals. At this time, the Italian peninsula was dominated by the Etruscans, whose trading networks extended south all the way to Greece. And along this, the tribal herders known as the Latins lived, a group which spoke their own dialect of Latin, and worshipped an adapted pantheon of the Greek gods. King Latinus of the Latins pledged his daughter to Aeneas, and the groups intermarried into a single people. However, this marriage caused a diplomatic stir in the region, and the Etruscans to the north moved south to nip the Latin-Trojan group in the bud, but Aeneas defeated them before his death and secured the river Tiber as the border between his people and the Etruscans. So succession would continue for many years along Aeneas' line, until his descendant Numitor was ousted from power by his brother, and Numitor's daughter Rhea was forced to become a Vestal virgin to end his line. However, she was the victim of a rape, and gave birth to twin boys. And despite claiming that Mars, the god of war, had in fact been her attacker, Rhea's sons were sentenced to death, so as to not have a claim on the throne, whilst their mother, guilty of nothing more than the crime of being raped, was imprisoned. The boys were taken to the banks of the river Tiber to be drowned, but survived, and ended up washed up on the shore where supposedly a wolf found the babies and breastfed them to keep them alive, before they were found and raised by a herdsman. The boys were named Romulus and Remus, and after growing up defending their home from bandits, they encountered their grandfather, the exiled king Numitor. And together they overthrew his brother and appointed Numitor as king once again. The now royal brothers decided to establish their own city at the spot where they had been left to drown, and during its construction there are multiple stories as to what happened, but no matter if Romulus, his followers, or Remus himself did it, Remus ended up dead and Romulus became the first king of Rome in 753 BC. The absolute underbelly of society, made up of criminals and fugitives, flocked to this town. You would never have found a more wretched hive of scum and villainy, and the first legion was raised out of the wealthiest of this population. A council of 100 senators was also created to help King Romulus govern, establishing some of the great patrician dynasties, which would exist as the nobility of the city for his future. And there we go, everything was established. The city could continue to grow in population and power until... Wait. Since the city had grown from fugitives and criminals, it was a massive sausage party with almost no women. Unwilling to let his city die in one generation, Romulus sent diplomats to request marriage to women from neighbouring cities, but were all refused by fathers unwilling to wed their daughters to this band of criminals. But unfortunately for the local ladies, Romulus was not going to accept this answer, and turned to kidnapping. The king hosted a great festival and invited all of the local communities to the city, before giving a signal for his men to seize all of the visiting women, famously with a group called the Sabines among them. The families were booted from the city and these communities were fought off. The Sabines attacked to recover their daughters, but these women were now mothers and managed to de-escalate the situation, and somehow the Sabines and the Romans then integrated. This episode has come to be known as the Rape of the Sabine Women. And whilst fans of Roman history can read about Caesar killing 1 million Gauls and think, awesome, I love that bloke, you can't help but wish that Romulus had found a better solution to this situation. So for the rest of his reign, King Romulus established the Romans as a military power, before in 717 BC he supposedly disappeared in a puff of smoke one day. He's pretty much a mythological figure, who was most likely invented to stand as some sort of god king who was responsible for the creation of every aspect of life in the Roman Republic, in the same sense that all history becomes more simplified. The different factions in the city bickered over who would succeed Romulus as king, and a member of the Sabines named Numa was chosen. Being a pacifist, he was the complete opposite of Romulus, and turned the warlike population into an extremely religious society, establishing the institutions of the Vestal Virgins and the separate head of faith known as the Pontifex Maximus, a title which would remain separate from the head of state until Augustus claimed it for the Caesars of the empire, and then it was transferred to the popes, who hold it to this day. Numa is likely also fictitious, and similarly to Romulus is likely a mythological figure who can be said to be responsible for all religious aspects of Roman life. For his entire 43-year reign, Rome enjoyed an anomalous period of peace. And following Numa's death, he must have hoped that his successor would continue his policy of peace and worship. Unfortunately, his successor was called Tullus Hostilius, and you shouldn't need me to tell you that this man reinvigorated people's martial spirit, fighting with local cities and forcing the cities of Albanon to become Roman after they betrayed his alliance. Under his successor King Ancus, similar victories were won over the inhabitants of the surrounding countryside. He founded the port of Ostia, connecting the city's territory to the Mediterranean for the first time, and Roman power swelled under Ancus's reign. All of these kings have likely been apocryphal figures, meaning it's doubtful they actually existed. However, the stories of them do attempt to explain the pillars of Roman society, that being a warlike spirit, strong legal code, and religious devotion. Lucius Tarquinius, or Tarquin, was a wealthy Etruscan businessman who moved to Rome and built up his prestige there, earning the attention of the aging king Ancus. Being made the guardian of his two sons and following the death of the king, he scammed the two boys out of the inheritance and had himself elected king. He ensured the loyalty of the Senate, constructed the Circus Maximus, and won many military victories, culminating in the first triumph in the city's history. Following this, the story of a baby surviving a fire unscathed circulated the city, and the king adopted this supposedly divine boy, Servius Tullus. However, when the cheated sons of the late Ancus managed to have Tarquin assassinated, Servius took over the role of king in secret, whilst maintaining the charade that Tarquin was still alive, in order to smoothen his inheritance until he was secure on the throne. Servius carried out the first census of the city, dividing the citizens into 5 classes based on how much military gear they could provide. Legions were raised from these classes, and the elections were determined by the upper classes who dominate the society. The son of the late Tarquin, Tarquinius Superbius, undertook a coup, and after 43 years, Servius was killed in 535 BC. And the new king, Tarquin the Proud, would go on to be the last king of Rome. A tyrannical king who you could compare to Pharaoh from the Exodus story, who in his vanity exploited the poor to raise monuments to himself and ruled through fear, bypassing all legal codes of the city, and ruining and killing any rivals he had to power. He took all power from the Senate. Ill will against Tarquin was ripe from both the citizens of the city and the nobility, and when Tarquin's son Sextus raped a woman, leading to her suicide, the army was rightfully disgusted and started a full-scale revolt to remove the Tarquins from power. So after 24 years of tyrannical rule, Tarquin the Proud and his family were exiled forever. The office of king was abolished in Rome and became a dirty word for the rest of his history. It was decided that 2 elected consuls would share the power of king for 1-year-long terms, so the power could never be held in the hands of a single man. And when in the future Augustus consolidated his own power and became emperor, he made it very clear that the people did not know him as king. So whilst the monarchy of the Roman kingdom had not been based entirely on hereditary succession, this also marks the beginning of power in Rome being held by men based on their competence, not their birth, a factor which allowed for such great successes. The ascension of the son of Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, is largely marked as the turning point in the history of the empire, with succession based on birth, not merit. But that was a long way away. In 509 BC, the men who had liberated the city were elected its first consuls, and the Roman Republic, which would go on to dominate the Mediterranean, was born. Thanks for watching.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is...